So welcome y'all who are watching the video after the fact. We're streaming directly from directly from Zoom again this time. So you're catching us without our nice little splash screen, which we normally would have that says like we're starting soon. So you're getting all the behind the scenes of us making sure everybody knows what's happening. Oh nice. I see Matthew, I see Jeannie. Hi. Good. I'm glad you're here. Welcome. As we get into things, I'm really excited actually about this Bible study live that we're doing today. We've titled it Coming Out with Joseph because we are continuing the story of Joseph that we started last month. So if you were here with us last month, we did the story of Joseph's coat, Joseph's princess dress, Joseph's coat of many colors, whatever it was. We talked about that last month. And that was such a fun conversation. We talked about how we wanted to continue that conversation, the conversation about Joseph's story. And so it seemed like Pride Month would be a good time for us to continue that story. So I'm very happy to be here talking about it. And hi, Eden, I see you. Eden, I was just thinking about you the other day and I thought, gosh, it's been a minute since I've seen Eden and I'm glad that you're here. So welcome everybody. Let's introduce ourselves before we get into it. I am happy to be back here with Peter like I was last month and with Micah, who's back after a long time away from Bible Study Live. So my name is Austin. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the executive director here at Transmission Ministry Collective. And this is one of my favorite things that we get to do is nerd out about the Bible together. So that's me. Who else wants to introduce themselves?
I'll pop in here. My name is Micah Melody. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am TMC's community care coordinator. And it's good to be back. Wasn't able to do this for a while because I am in school and had a class that was competing with this time. So I'm happy to be here again.
We're super happy you're back.
And I'm Peter, they, them pronouns, development and communications coordinator at TMC. Also very excited to have Micah Melody back.
Yeah, and we're going to continue, like we've had such a great time having guests in over the last few months. And so we're going to continue doing that, having folks from the community and the leadership cohort come in and join us. But this month, we thought we'd give everybody a break from requests because there's so much going on because it's Pride Month. So yeah, we will continue to have guests as we go on. So fear not. So to get into our discussion topic today, as I said, we're continuing the story of Joseph. And so we are going to be talking about Genesis chapter 45. So if you have a Bible around you or you have a online access to a Bible that you like or a translation that you like, grab Genesis 45 in whatever translation you prefer. And we are going to be reading the story in that chapter. We're going to do the full chapter in 3 different chunks. So we're going to break it down a little bit. Before we get into this chapter, it starts out very like in media res, like we start in the moment. And so we have to talk a little bit about the background for what's happening with Joseph's story. Last time we saw Joseph was a teenager. And in this story, Joseph is a full-on adult. So Micah, do you want to give us the background on what's happened with Joseph between these 2 stories?
Yeah. So since the last time that we saw Joseph, at the end of the section kind of last time, I think the passage just right after that, Joseph is sold into slavery and sold to Potiphar, who is the captain of the guard of Egypt. After being in prison, he was in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He was framed and ended up making friends with his fellow prisoners, which that is another fascinating story that I love. That's a really fascinating story of the time in Joseph's life. He ends up being let out of prison to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And he does it correctly and is able to prepare Egypt for a time of famine. And also therefore becomes Pharaoh's top advisor. And meanwhile, Joseph's brothers, except for Benjamin, are coming to Egypt to buy food in the middle of the famine, because the famine has started. I think it's a couple years have gone through, and people throughout all of the surrounding lands are not prepared like Egypt is, and so people are coming to buy food. But when his brothers come, they don't recognize him. So Joseph sends them back home with food, but with the condition that they bring Benjamin back. So they bring Benjamin back, and Joseph sets up a test of honesty for the brothers, in which he also puts a cup in some flour and sends them back, and then accuses them of stealing the cup. And he ends up threatening to keep Benjamin with him as punishment for their crimes. And Judah, the brother who actually suggested in the first place that Joseph be sold instead of killed, speaks up for Benjamin and to protect him, and offers himself, Judah himself, in Benjamin's place. And so it's quite a few chapters between last time and this one, and a lot has happened in Joseph's life, but this is kind of where we're at. So this has been happening. Joseph has been basically putting on this show of like pretending to be and accusing the brothers of this crime to test them. And that's where we're going to pick up.
Mm-hmm. Tricksy Joseph is very legitimately very skeptical of his brothers showing up in town.
Understandably.
Exactly. Is wondering hey, are these people still jerks? I'm going to try and figure that out by putting them through some tests. Interesting stuff here with Joseph. So right before chapter 45, like Micah said, Judah, the oldest brother, gives this very impassioned speech about we can't leave Benjamin, the youngest brother, alone in Egypt. We have to bring him home. If you're going to try to keep him, then I offer myself instead. So there's this moment of selflessness from Judah, which is very unlike what he did for Joseph. So that's what's going on. And that's what Judah has just said before we start chapter 45. So let's read chapter 45, the first part here. Chapter 45, we are going to read verses, just the very first few verses, verses 1 through 3, just to get us a sense of where things are happening here. So I'll read it for us. I'm reading from, actually, we should say what we're reading from. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, which is my go-to. What are y'all reading from?
I am also reading for that version as well.
Updated.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, so we're all doing the same edition here. Well, then I'm going to change it up because I love to have just a little bit of difference here. So I'm going to pull up the, which one do I want? This is asking me to pick a favorite child. I'm going to do something a little different here and pick the Common English Bible. The Common English Bible is an interesting one. It sometimes has some really interesting ways of describing things. Sometimes I argue with their translation a little bit, but I enjoy reading it. So I'm going to read Common English Bible then.
And I'm going to actually switch to the NIV. So.
Oh, heck yeah. Awesome. So if you are in the chat and you want to tell us what you're reading from, you can totally do that as well. So I'm going to read verses 1 through 3 here of chapter 45. Joseph could no longer control himself in front of all his attendants, so he declared, "Everyone, leave now." No one stayed with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians and Pharaoh's household heard him. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father really alive?" His brothers couldn't respond because they were terrified before him. So, any translational differences there that we want to talk about? I feel like it's probably fairly close across that first 3 verses.
There's one phrase that I noticed that was different. The NRSV updated edition says, "So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers," which I think it feels a little more profound than what was revealed. I think yours was revealed.
Mine was revealed his identity, like he's Batman or something.
Yeah, right. And that just seems a little more superficial than made himself known. That
made himself
more
known.
Like a deeper revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Mine also says made himself known. And something because I read the NRSV where it says, "I am Joseph," and At the NRSV, there's a period at the end of that sentence, but in the NIV, there's an exclamation mark. So I really like that little just like punctuation difference, because I mean, it is a very emotional thing. He's really putting himself out there. So I really like that little subtle difference there.
It's true. The Common English Bible also has the exclamation point after I am Joseph, which is nice. Let's see. So I'm seeing in the chat here from different people. Eden is reading Robert Alter's translation. Ooh, I love that. Robert Alters, I've got him on my bookshelf behind me, which says dismayed instead of terrified, which is interesting. And then Jeannie says, I have the NIV open, but I pulled up the Message from Bible Gateway. Nice. I love seeing message differences. It's such an interesting translation. And then Eden says, I have made himself known as well in Robert Alter's translation. Fascinating. Well, cool. So we've got this first part of the story, right, where Joseph reveals himself or makes himself known to his brothers, and then he weeps. So let's talk a little bit about this first part of the story. First question for everybody. Why does Joseph make everybody go away? Why does Joseph say, like, everybody get out, leave me here, like, besides his brothers, obviously? Micah and Peter, do you have any thoughts on why Joseph would want everybody else out before he does this?
I've always thought about this in like, this is it's a family moment, right? This is like a very private kind of intimate thing of needing this space to make sure that everything's right with Joseph's family. So I think, as I probably would do the same thing, honestly. Like I probably would like, I need this time alone. I mean, I've definitely had those moments of, having serious conversations with family members, and doing it around even friends, even close friends, can be sometimes really awkward. So I've definitely had those moments where I've like pulled a family member aside and gone outside or done that sort of thing. So I think that would be one thing that I would think of. And just, I think what my response would be, probably do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there's kind of a vulnerability too, right? Of like revealing a lot about his past. I mean, he's this very powerful figure at this point in this society that he's, been adopted by. And he's sharing more of like these like his past, his childhood, his family connections. Maybe a lot of people don't know about that, and he feels like he needs to kind of keep that to himself.
Yeah, it makes me wonder about his experience of life as a Hebrew person in Egypt, and like if he felt like he had to keep these parts of himself separate, like they maybe couldn't go together. Yeah, interesting thought. When I was reading about this, one of the things I read about was Abraham Ibn Ezra, who's a commentator, like a very famous Jewish commentator, talked about how we're told in chapter 42, verse 23, it says that Joseph is only speaking to his brothers this whole time through an interpreter. So like he's speaking in like the Egyptians' language and is getting an interpreter to speak to his brothers. So there's like a sense of distance there. And then Ibn Ezra says that in Joseph's sort of speech to his brothers, which we're going to read in a second, he says, I am speaking to you now with my own mouth. And so Ibn Ezra talks about how maybe in this moment there was a movement of like sending everybody out so that he could speak his brother's language and like his birth language with his family without like having that Egyptian interpretation there, which I thought was really interesting to think about, like how language functions and the language that we use with the people that we're close to. So I kind of like that interpretation. When we think about like what's going on here with the brothers and with Judah, especially with Judah saying, hey, I will put myself on the line for Benjamin, my younger brother, in a way that he never did for Joseph. Like he told the other brothers, like, don't kill Joseph, just sell him into slavery. So like he kind of did something, but like in this story, Judah seems like he's learned something about like how to take care of his family. And there was, I kind of wonder, like, how did Joseph feel seeing Judah stand up for Benjamin in a way that he had never stood up for Joseph? And I think it must have been both a like painful thing and maybe a feeling of relief, like at the same time of like, okay, it seems like he's learned something. It seems like he's like figured out a different way to be, but also the pain of knowing like, I wish he would have done that for me, like we don't even know actually in this story whether Joseph knows that Judah was the one who saved his life. Like we don't know. So it's an interesting kind of thing to think about what Joseph would have been feeling in that moment. There's a quote that I'm going to read, which is from the Queer Bible Commentary. The Genesis commentary and the Queer Bible Commentary is written by Michael Carden. And Michael says, Judah, the oldest brother, has been shocked out of the complacent sense of privilege that the patriarchal hierarchy has inculcated into him, and forced to express his connectedness and reverse his roles in the abuse of Joseph. With Joseph, all Judah was interested in was the profit that could be made in selling Joseph into slavery. Now, in front of Joseph, he intervenes to speak up for his brother when he is about to be bound in captivity. And Benjamin, to Benjamin's surprise, this powerful foreign prince is suddenly revealed as his big fairy brother, long lost long ago. Which I kind of love that idea of like this sort of moment of like this brother that you've probably been told a lot about, or maybe you even have memories of, and then finding somebody who you're so connected to. So I don't know, I just like that moment of like Judah kind of saying, hey, I've actually learned something from this. I'm going to do something different.
It is such an interesting, complicated, even thinking about Joseph's emotions in this moment. As I was just sitting with that question a little bit, I think as I'm trying to put myself in that place, because I don't know how to feel. I'm sure there would be a lot of complication. And obviously, I think, there is this moment of Joseph testing his brothers to see if they've changed in any way. I think Eden earlier said I feel like it could also be some revenge. So there's like even ways that, as part of the testing, there is like, there's some like getting back at, but I think also in this moment of, wait, why? I think I'd be left with feelings of like, why didn't you do that for me? Like, and I've been, I think many of us might have been in those places where there's like where someone interacts with someone else differently than they should have interacted in ways that they should have interacted with you. And that's like, it's a hard thing to reconcile. At the same time, I think it does show that someone is capable of change. So it's a both and. It's not a very easy like either or answer, or complicated feelings.
Totally. Yeah, and feelings are like all about what happened in verse 2, right? Joseph weeping so loudly that the Egyptians and all of Pharaoh's household could hear him. I wonder about what's going on with Joseph's emotions in that moment, and like why it's written that way. What do you think, Micah?
Well, I mean, I think as I'm just thinking about the kind of where this is an incredibly emotional moment, and just I appreciate the way that the text is written to kind of draw out the emotions. And it's very dramatic. This is almost feels like if this was, a play, which I know it has been made into a play, like there are people, this has been done. This feels like the climax almost of like a moment of, and the emotional climax of a play where there's this big revelation that's happening. And it's not only a revelation for the brothers who are shocked into silence, like we see in verse 3, but also like Joseph probably has this incredibly emotional response. And I love the fact that like Joseph allows himself to cry and to weep and to wail, and even to the point that the Egyptians hear it. And so I think, it makes sense that this would be incredibly emotional. Any thoughts like Austin or Peter or anyone in the chat on why this is like written in this emotional, the emotional response is written in this way?
I mean, I think about the like many years that he's been holding all of this in. Like there's, like you were saying, this is a very complicated moment. I don't think everything, from the past is just automatically erased or all better, or, I'm sure that a lot of the emotion that he's feeling is like the pain of the ways he was hurt, and then seeing like the possibility for some different future with his family, and and feeling finally safe to
Mhm.
reveal himself in this way.
Mhm.
You know, there's that feeling of release.
Right.
There's
Yeah,
just
it's
a lot
very
of stuff going on.
right. There's interesting that like in the story so far, Joseph has cried 3 times since his brothers have gotten to Egypt. And the first 2 times, like when he was like surprised and saw them for the first time, and the second time when he saw Benjamin for the first time. But in both of those earlier 2 times, he like went away and like cried privately and then like washed his face and came back. And this time he's actually letting himself have emotions with people around. And
Mhm.
that feels meaningful to me. Like, especially we've talked like, so two things. One, I was going to say one thing and then immediately double crossed myself in my thought patterns. I was going to say that we've talked before about how like our whole first time talking about Joseph was talking about how Joseph doesn't fill a lot of like masculine qualities that we would associate with masculinity, and like Joseph instead seems to present as more gender fluid or gender queer throughout his story. And so I was going to say something about like expressing emotions in a way that men maybe aren't expected to. But then also my second thought was, but that wasn't true in biblical times. That like in the time when this story was written, men cried publicly all the time. So even though today we read it and we go, oh, that seems very like Joseph seems very in touch with his emotions for a masculine presenting person, whereas at the time it probably wasn't that weird. It's interesting to think about. So let's get into the kind of reason that we're talking about this story for Pride Month, and that is this connection that a lot of queer theologians have made, queer and trans theologians have made, with this moment of Joseph revealing himself or making himself known, and the concept of coming out, right? That there seems to be like our making ourselves known to the world around us in ways that we choose, when we choose, to who we choose. Like that's a very important thing in a lot of people's lives. So I think we have some quotes here about, or some thoughts about that. I think you had one, Peter.
Yeah, there's a really fantastic quote from a book called Torah Queries. Denise L. Egger has a piece called Forgiveness as a Queer Response. And I feel like, you know, forgiveness is one word that she uses here, but in this quote that I'm going to read, she uses the word reconciliation, which I think is maybe a more appropriate word to use for what's going on, because it's more of a forgiveness can seem very simplistic, but reconciliation, you know, involves a lot more. So this is her quote. With these words, I am Joseph. Joseph reveals his true self, his true identity. Joseph reconnects with his past not only by his brother's presence, but inside himself to claim his place in the family. His revelation is met with astonishment and fear, weeping, and ultimately reunion. The reunion is with his brothers, but it is also so much more. It represents reconciliation of self, of true identity. Joseph hid his familial ties as a Hebrew, perhaps because it was too painful to feel the rejection of his brothers, or perhaps because a Hebrew slave had no real place in Egyptian society. But now Joseph can finally speak freely in Egypt about his God and his family. He connects with his roots, bringing them into his present. And Pharaoh is so pleased to see him at peace and happy with himself that he grants Joseph and his family a choice area of Egypt in which to dwell. So it seems to speak to a lot of like different elements of what this represents to Joseph. You know, it's a sort of integration happening inside himself, as well as like this sort of outward reunion with his family.
Yeah, for sure. And it speaks back to what we said earlier about the possibility of like maybe Joseph felt like he had to very much compartmentalize himself and different parts of his identity and like what was acceptable in what places. And it seems like in this moment, he's starting to allow those things to like come together in a way that's, I think, the experience of a lot of people in coming out is being like, hey, I don't want to live a fragmented life anymore. Yeah. Micah, you were saying how like the brother's response or the fear of the brother's response is also kind of reminiscent of that experience.
Yeah, before we do that, I want to make sure I see a couple things that popping up in the chat. I think our stream is like about a minute or so lagging from where we're at. So if we don't get to your comments or your questions right away, we might be a little just ahead of where the stream is right now. But I see Eden says, was it common for someone in a position of power like Joseph to show emotion so openly in Egyptian culture? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I think that would be a really good thing to dig into, to think about that. And Water says, yeah, it upsets me that the spectrum of acceptable masculinity has become so narrow in the West. And absolutely. And as one of the things I love about reading scripture in both the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, just the range of emotion displayed by irregardless of gender, but especially thinking about it in the context of men, given the context of masculinity that we see in Western culture. So I think those are really great things to point out and pay attention to. But as we're talking about, like, I'm curious also too, as we're talking about this in the context of coming out, and talking about Joseph's, if anyone in the chat, like, what kind of connections you're seeing or any similarities to experiences you've had or things you're thinking about. Because when I was reading this, I was really struck by verse 3, where it says, but this is in the NRSV, but his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. And I'm just I think that right there, the brothers being so shocked into silence by kind of the revelation of who Joseph actually is. I really resonate with that, not as the brothers, but almost as Joseph, because I've definitely had those moments of when I've come out to people who have known me for a long time, and people are like, but like, there were no signs, or
Right.
or the feelings of like just the shock nature that people had when I started telling them about who I am. And I've talked to other, folks where I know that there can be this way that when we choose to come out or invite people in to our story and to who we are, we can be met with this sense of disbelief or shocked. In the case of the brothers, the way I read it is, I feel like there's a lot of different emotions. And so I'm curious also too, if anyone has any thoughts on what emotions the brothers might have been feeling through this revelation. Personally, I think I read it as probably there's probably guilt in there from, they literally, they sold their brother into slavery. It's probably a lot of guilt. There's also probably like a confusion on how to even process the fact that the brother is actually alive, that they probably never expected to see anymore. So see Joseph ever again. So yeah, just a lot of complex emotions. And so I think about, what does that look like for other people when we come out or choose to invite them into our story? What are the emotions that they feel? Like, how are they responding in the moment? And how do we see those parallels? Anyone else have any thoughts on this?
What you said about the, there were no signs thing, like that, it's such a classic thing that, like, if there were signs that people thought that they did, where the people are like, well, I never would have guessed, when it's like, it's either that or it's either it was such a thing that they expected, but they didn't expect it the way that they thought it would happen, or like there's never a moment where people are like, oh yes, okay, great, everything makes sense and we are on board. Like, that feels like it's such a I don't know, something about that resonated with me. Yeah. I see Jeannie say there's fear of retribution, which can definitely be part of it. And then Amory saying a reality reorientation, which is, I think, what a lot of people go through in that moment of like, oh, everything is different now. And for the people who are sharing of themselves, there's a moment of everything is different now because I've said something and that's going to change things. And for the people that are hearing it, it's everything is different now because I know this thing I didn't know before. So yeah, there's definitely a reorienting of everything in that moment for all people involved. So let's see. I think you've got one more quote here about Joseph coming out, Micah.
Yeah, but I think we're going to talk about that a little bit at verse 4.
Right. I'm a verse ahead of us. I got too far ahead. All right, Peter, will you read verses 4 through 15 for us for our second chunk of the story?
Sure thing. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here.' Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him."
A translation difference that I note, just sort of a minor one in that last verse. It ends with, in the Common English Bible, it ends with, his brothers were finally able to talk to him, which I kind of like as a translation, that like Joseph had to do that whole speech before his brothers were like, okay.
Yeah, the NIV just says afterward his brothers talked with him, but there's a footnote and a cross reference back to verse 3 where they were in silence.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this way that there is the emotional kind of release, and then the explanation, and even kind of what I think it was Jeannie said, fear of retribution. Joseph is like, hey, don't worry. Like, I mean, like, this is kind of the do not be afraid sort of thing. Like, you know, you did this thing, it was wrong, but I'm not going to like retaliate. And there is this sense of openness that happens after Joseph speaks.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Kind of what you were mentioning, the quote that I found in relation to this. I love this quote because it was talking about coming out in the context of the idea of coming out, and Joseph in the context of reasserting identity as an equal part of an inequality. And I really love, I think it's in, I'm looking really quickly, when Joseph says, "Come close to me. Now do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." So there is this reestablishing of connection with family. And it's also like Joseph is reasserting that now, yes, Joseph is in a place of power, but he's also not, he's not also in a place it's going to be in retribution. There is this reestablishing of equal relationship. And so this quote comes from Gary Simpson on the Whosoever website. And he writes, "Coming out is an act of establishing a sense of equality. There is no equality and no hope of equality in a closet, the land of the inferior. In many respects, coming out makes the statement, I am equal. I deserve to be respected and treated with respect and dignity. I deserve the sunlight and the sunlight every bit as much as everyone else. The action of coming out takes a person out of the darkness of solitary confinement and oppression into enhanced equality and light." And in the rest of the article, he kind of draws that parallel with Joseph coming out of this place of being literally in slavery, in this place of darkness, in this like in the history of being literally in prison, probably a dark prison cell, coming now fully into the light, being able to reveal his full self to the Egyptians and to his brothers. and there is this reestablishing of equal relationship. And I just really love the idea of coming out, and not everyone is safe to do so. Coming out is a complicated thing, but when it is a possibility, and however it happens for people, it is a way that it's like a reestablishing of equal relationship and writing and justice. And so I just really love that.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm going to jump ahead for a second to something that's said in verse 7, because it kind of connects, where Joseph talks about how he has, God has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. There's this moment where Joseph is kind of saying, like, here's the power that I have now. And I'm so interested in the power dynamics here between Joseph and his brothers, because I do think that that's true. I think there's a sense of like an equity or equality where Joseph finally gets to be like, here I am, and here you are, and I'm no longer going to be inferior to you. But Joseph also does seem to really lean on sharing how much power he has now at the same time. And I think about that and I wonder, is that Joseph, is he just like stating a fact and saying like, I can help you and here's why? Maybe that's what he's doing. Or is it him saying, I have power now, and so you can't hurt me anymore? And I kind of wonder if maybe there's a little bit of that going on. Like, I imagine if I was Joseph in that moment, I would want my brothers to know that they no longer have power over me, even if I'm not going to use it. Even if I'm not going to use power over them, I want them to know that they don't have it over me either, and that there is that sense of equity there. So I don't know. I'm fascinated by that. Do you two have thoughts?
Yeah. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, Peter. But the first thing that's coming to mind is the way that I will say, when I was hiding and when I was like, before I came out and before I was myself, I was terrified of the power that other people had over me.
Mm-hmm.
But now that I am fully myself, I am in a place where I am more confident in who I am. And I've been able to move into these spaces of doing really cool things and getting to like work with cool people and getting to meet like cool people within TMC and just having these conversations all the time. I feel so much more at home with who I am. And I tell people about it. And it's not necessarily I'm not doing it to like, it's not a look at me sort of thing, but I'm just like, it's joyful. Like, this is where I'm at. Look at how did I end up here? And I almost wonder, I mean, I think we can also read this as, Joseph asserting this, like, you don't have power over me. But I wonder if this is like just Joseph just being like, look at what God did. Look where I'm at. Here's, and at the same time, there is this like assurance to others, like you don't get to dictate and make me feel this sense of fear that I felt in the past, or the sense of like, there is a freedom that comes with that. And I also wonder at the same time, if there's a little bit of like Joseph being like, look at, I have all this, but I am not going to do to you what you did to me. Right. There is like this, I'm going to respond in justice, not in retribution. And so maybe there is also some naming of that to make sure that they know, like, oh, you do have this ability, but you're not going to use it. It's making it explicit and putting it out on the table so that everyone's aware of what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder, folks in the chat, if you have thoughts on why Joseph shares his like position in the way that he does. But what do you think, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of it being kind of analogous to, we're talking about it as a story of coming out, analogous to the sense of power that we feel in those moments, or it's like stepping into our own power, our own self-determination, like our own ability to like shape our own future, and that he has that in that moment. I also sort of, I kind of want to live vicariously through Joseph a little bit, because I mean, I've gradually come to the point where I feel that sense of my own power, but I had lots of conversations early on in the context of coming out where I didn't feel that, or it felt like the other person or the people I was speaking with still had power over me. Mm-hmm. And so it's a satisfying story in that sense, where it's like, he's untouchable here, and the beauty, as you were saying, of the fact that he has the power to hurt back.
Mm,
It doesn't,
right.
and that being its own like inner power that he is like
Mhm.
showing and experiencing. Like, yeah, he could take revenge on them. He could have them all put to death. He could, um, and he makes a different choice than that, and that is a really powerful thing too.
Yeah, and that's where that the title of the article that we mentioned earlier, forgiveness as a queer response, like that's the point of that article, is like the traditional response for Joseph, the cultural response would be to take revenge on his brothers. Like he has absolute right to do so. It says exactly in the law what he is allowed to do, and so like he could have done that, but he chooses a different path that is going to set him on a completely different trajectory. And there's something that is a little queer about that in the best way. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how Joseph is dealing with this, because I think when we read this story of Joseph having all this trauma happen to him, all these bad things happen to him, and then he just decides not to pursue like retribution, and he like pursues forgiveness and reconciliation instead. Sometimes when I read this story, I go, Joseph does not sound like a real person. Nobody would be able to experience what Joseph experienced and just be like, it's all fine, guys. God meant it all for good. Like nobody's that pious. So I wonder about our experience of Joseph. Like, is Joseph, can we see ourselves in Joseph in believing that it would be possible for us to make that decision? You know what I mean? Like, does it feel possible for us to be able to experience that kind of reconciliation? And is it okay to recognize that there can be a difference between the sort of way of thinking that says, well, God meant for all this to happen, including all the terrible things that happened to me, versus a thought process that says, God never wanted anybody to suffer, but God will turn suffering into life regardless. And like there's a difference there in those two different worldviews. And so I always worry that we're going to get stuck in the worldview of like, all that suffering was okay because God made it turn out well, rather than saying suffering happens, but God can turn it into something different. I don't know. What do you all think? Does Joseph's response feel possible?
I want to say yes. Like it's hard to believe.
Mm,
I think, just speaking honestly, it's hard sometimes to think that there can be full redemption and or reconciliation in some situations. But also at the same time, I hold out hope that there can be good things. And I love what you said about the difference between God, God wanting bad things to happen versus God making good out of the bad. And to geek out here on something that Peter will laugh about, and maybe some folks also like, reminds me of the eucatastrophe, which is a thing that is a very Tolkien-esque thing. From This is my Lord of the Rings nerd coming out, but the
I love
idea all the time.
Yeah.
But the idea of the eucatastrophe in literature, also and we see this in scripture a lot, is the idea that something terrible happens, but out of that terrible thing that's happening, the best good can happen. And an example of Tolkien's writing, it's the fact that at the very end, Gollum gets the ring, but Gollum gets the ring, falls, like spoilers, sorry, but like but that actually leads to a better good. And so in this case, with going back to Joseph, this was an awful thing that happened to Joseph that should never have happened to Joseph. But like some amazing good comes out of it. And I see Amory says it's about the transformative power of love. And I think that's beautiful. There is transformation of possibility of love.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I see Eden says, sometimes it feels like the expectation for queer people is to forgive, and it's the opposite of the expectation for Joseph. So like for us, the only cultural story is that we have to forgive everybody who, dead names us and doesn't get it and responds poorly to us. And so what do we do with that? That's the cultural expectation that we are saddled with. Thanks, Eden. I appreciate that. What do you think, Peter? Does Joseph's response feel possible?
I mean, I think what you said is really critical, that distinction. You know, I definitely, I think that there's a really, really toxic way to read this and other stories like it, which is, yeah, basically sort of making suffering in and of itself a good or a holy thing. And I think that can be so dangerous and hurt people so badly. But the idea that restoration is possible, integration is possible, reconciliation, even if like that hadn't meant his reconciliation with his brothers. If we think about it more symbolically than that, like reconciliation to himself, to his identity, you know, to both his past and his future, like that feels possible. It doesn't always look the same way, I don't think, but seeing that as a possibility feels possible.
Yeah, I agree. I can't believe we're like getting close to the end of our time together, and we haven't even gotten close to the end of our story. So we're going to have to skip a couple of things. But I want to go to your quote, Joseph, your quote, Peter, that you have on Joseph's tender boundaries. Will you read that for us?
Oh yeah, it's actually, I think, quite related to what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So this was from, I need to get the name of the author here who wrote this reflection. Give me 1 second.
No worries. This is why we get to, for folks that are not familiar with Bible Study Live, after we're done with the Bible Study Live and the videos rendering and everything, we go in and we put links to all of our resources and references in the description. So if you're watching this and you're like, what's Peter looking for? It'll be in the description.
Yes. Rachel Ward is the name of this writer. They're a minister at Middle Church.
Yeah.
So this is their quote about Joseph's tender boundaries, which I thought was just a very meaningful phrase that I think I will come back to. As he wrestles with his own PTSD from family estrangement, Joseph offers tenderness to himself first and his family second. He doesn't run back to his homestead after discovering their presence. He sends his brothers on that journey. They too need to discover this tenderness along their journey. He doesn't strip his transformation of clothing, stature, culture, and being. He remains his transformed self, but offers land and food to his family when they come before him on his own terms.
Yeah. Tender boundaries is a great way to put that, of like willing to try something different, willing to be more flexible, willing to follow like your ethical standards of what you believe is the right thing to do. And also, have a good sense of self as you're doing it.
Yeah, I like that phrase. He remains his transformed self. Like he doesn't feel like he has to strip himself of any of these things that he has learned about himself, gained for himself, in order to meet them where they are. They have to come to him. You know? And that seems significant.
Yeah.
I love he sends his brothers on that journey.
Mm-hmm.
There is and I think that's so wise thinking about that. It's when we have those moments of like, and I'm thinking about this in the coming out analogy, we have those moments of like sharing new things about ourselves with others. I think there's also sometimes expectations from others that we return to who we were, or like, or we help them get to where we are. And those things are helpful, and Joseph is providing. Joseph is providing food and shelter and what is needed, but he doesn't like he's allowing them to do that work and themselves, and be part of that, and not trying to like take too much on for himself, or leave behind the new things that have been good for him. So I think that's really, I just really like that phrase of sends his brothers on that journey. Like I need that. I need that reminder.
Yeah, the very end of the story has another little bit of Joseph sending his brothers on a journey that's like an Easter egg in this story. So hold on to that for a second. Because I want to go to the chat here. Eden says, when there's a true choice to forgive, it feels so much better. If I could have true reconciliation with my family, it would be amazing. I hear that, Eden. Yeah, it's reconciliation and forgiveness and things like that can only happen when they get to be a true choice and they're not just an expectation that you have to follow through with, or they're not just one-sided. So I hear you for sure. Amory says, perhaps Joseph understands that his terrible personal ordeal is beyond even his own pain, but includes possibility for new life and new meaning for his people. Yeah, there's a possibility that Joseph recognizes that what happened to him is so far beyond what could ever be understood or forgiven that even asking that question of forgiveness maybe isn't even helpful. That maybe he's just like, we have to move forward. And that's why he does what he does. That's definitely possible. I can see that. So we've got to read the last section of our text here. The last section are verses, 16 through 28 are the final ones. Micah, will you read that for us?
Yes, let me unmute myself really quick. 16 through the end of the chapter. When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers, do this, load your animals and return to the land of Canaan and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt and you can enjoy the fat of the land. You are also directed to tell them, do this, take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives and get your father to come. Never mind about your belongings, because all the best of all of Egypt will be yours. So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts, as Pharaoh had commanded, and he also gave them provisions for their journey. To each of them he gave new clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And this is what he sent to his father: 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other provisions for his journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, don't quarrel on the way. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him, Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all of Egypt. Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, I'm convinced. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die.
Oh, I love that. I love that what Israel says, his words in the chapter they appear to be kind of difficult to translate because there's so many different ways that that's written. My translation says, then Israel said, this is too much. My son Joseph is alive. So it seems like whatever he said was sort of some kind of exclamation of like, no way. Yeah, so we have this under the story with all of the family coming to live in Egypt with Joseph and having a big old family reunion there. But it's a process to move a huge family of many, many, many children and wives and grandchildren and all kinds of people all the way to Egypt. So there's a little bit of a journey they have to go on first. So I want to point us to that moment when Joseph is giving gifts to his brothers. So he gives gifts of clothing and all kinds of stuff. And it says that he gives all his brothers a set of clothing, but he gives Benjamin 5 sets of clothing. And that when I was reading this story, that was the first thing that jumped out to me out of this whole chapter. I was like, that is so interesting that we started this story with Joseph's clothing being this really important thing, and Joseph's coat, dress, whatever it was, gets taken away and like torn up, right? And soaked in blood. And then in this moment, Joseph is giving his brothers clothing. So Joseph's brothers took his clothing and he's giving his brothers clothing instead. And there's this great like beginning and end of this act of the story that you just couldn't write a better story, right? Like it's such a good bookend. But it's so interesting that he gives Benjamin 5 sets of clothing and the other brothers only 1. And so I was thinking about it and was like, hang on, something seems like Benjamin is Joseph's favorite. Benjamin is Joseph's only full brother. So like the favoritism is showing up again, right? And that seems to be a thread in this family, is the thread of favoritism. So what's happening here? So I was looking for some sort of thoughts about why this is happening, and this is what I found. This is from a Devar Torah, which is essentially like a sermon, if you're Jewish, from Rabbi Josh Birkenwald, who is at a synagogue in California. So he says, when they were kids, Jacob favored Joseph over all the others. He loved him more. He did not make him work in the fields. Jacob even gave Joseph the famous coat of many colors, which symbolized everything that the brothers hated about him. Joseph is now repeating the exact same provocations. Not only does Joseph favor Benjamin, but he does so with clothing. That detail had to have registered with their siblings. What's going on? Is Joseph being naive or cruel? Neither. This is another test. Joseph is not done with his brothers. So far, he's applied the pressure directly to see if the brothers will take responsibility for each other when confronted with an outside threat, and they've passed this test. Now, Joseph sends them back into the wilderness, unsupervised, with a brother who's been given a special treatment. It would be easy enough for Benjamin to get lost or be eaten by wild animals on the way. Joseph has recreated the conditions under which they had originally sinned years earlier, but Joseph doesn't want them to fail. 2 verses later, he undermines the purity of his test by warning them to behave. I just thought that was such an interesting way to think about it, that maybe what Joseph is doing here by favoring Benjamin with these extra clothes is putting the same temptation in front of the brothers and saying, will you hurt one of your own again, to see what would happen. So that sense of like sending the brothers on their journey seems to be happening again, which is an interesting way of thinking about that. What do you two think? And what do folks think in the chat about what Joseph is doing here, favoring Benjamin?
I think that's really an interesting, that being another test specifically, like that kind of the repetition of the favoring to mirror what was done, and as like repeat the as it was put, the temptation is put in front of them again to do the same thing. And it also kind of adds more context to the do not quarrel along the way, which is interesting because the Hebrew was very strange there. But like, yeah, just thinking about, don't allow yourself to fall into more like agitation, or don't like, and it's almost a command, but in a way, I almost see it, if this is actually what was going on, as less of a test and more, sort of a test, but almost giving them an opportunity to grow. So it's like, he's saying, don't do this again. And here's an opportunity to resist this. And yeah, so I like that. It's an interesting interpretation.
What do you think, Peter? Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and kind of I noticed that do not quarrel line on this reading that I hadn't really noticed before. So it would kind of cast that into a different light.
Yeah, there's so many reasons that the brothers could be having arguments along the way home, like blaming each other for what happened to Joseph in the beginning. Like there's so many reasons they could have been quarreling, but I kind of love that reading of like Joseph giving them a second chance to do something different this time. The downside of that reading is I don't like the idea of Joseph being okay with doing the test on Benjamin. So I don't love that possibility. And it doesn't seem like Joseph would put Benjamin in danger based on what's happened so far. So I don't know. It's an interesting reading of what could be happening here.
I think also too, to know the historical or the kind of literary context of Benjamin and Joseph were like their mother, and the kind of there's a whole complicated nature of the 12 siblings and their parenting, and like basically the different there are 4 different women that were very used and pitted against each other. And so there's this whole history there. And Benjamin is the youngest son of the favored of Israel's favored wife. So that's a whole part of the thing in the context too, that probably also plays into the favoritism here too. And so I've been thinking about that too.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. So, Peter, I think you've got a last question for us to think on a little bit. Thinking about how this connects with what we talked about last time.
Yeah, we didn't talk very much about, Joseph's gender identity this time around, except, insofar as we were talking about coming out as an idea. But, he does get described and describes himself using a lot of, male language in this passage, son, brother, father. And so like a question of like, do we hearken back at all to those things that we were learning about Joseph in that earlier part of the story? Like, is this in contradiction to that? Is this, is it not? Like, what do we think as we like bring this part of his story to a close?
Yeah, to me, I think Joseph still reads as a very queer character throughout his story. And the fact that the language used about him in the first story we looked at in Genesis 37 was so feminine, and the language used about him in this chapter is masculine, does not make him any less queer in my mind. Like, he can use different kinds of language and it's fine.
I mean, as as a non-binary person, like I love that actually. Like,
Yeah.
I kind of, if anything, it kind of like gives me more points of connection with like the fluidity of Joseph's gender and the ways in which he finds meaning and expressing it in these conventionally feminine or conventionally masculine ways, and like all of them can be part of his experience. It's a cool thing, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely think I agree. I absolutely agree that just, changing the language, or like, because the language reads more masculine does not, in this moment, does not mean that we have to throw out reading Joseph through a queer lens. In fact, I actually think it invites it, because exactly what you said, Peter, there is fluidity in the language and the way that Joseph's story is discussed. And so, I think also that reflects the way that for some folks, like, ideas and sense of gender can shift over time. There are, gender fluid folks, as well as, people who discover new things about their gender identity or their queerness later on in life. That's like part of, for many folks, part of the queer story experience. And so I think even that kind of shifting and the different ways that are being talked, that Joseph is being talked about and talks about himself and describes himself, I think it actually invites kind of more queer readings and invites more approaching of that. And obviously with the context of knowing we will never know. And these are, queer reading is giving ourselves the permission to allow our own experience as queer and trans folks to like allow us to see ourselves in text. And knowing that it's anachronistic to like assign a specific label to Joseph, but we can have fun, thinking about it.
And if it's something that allows biblical stories to speak into our lives and allows us to be able to see God in our lives, in the connections to these stories, it feels like that's the important thing, is to be able to have that connection. So yeah, I really appreciate us getting to talk about this story. I appreciate everybody in the chat sharing too about how this connects with their stories and thoughts that you have about what we talked about today. This was a really fun one to talk about for Pride Month. To kind of wrap us up here, things to know is our next Bible Study Live will be on July 19th. So keep an eye out for that. July 19th will be a fun one, I think, as well. And then a couple of announcements. The first one is that TMC is currently doing our June fundraiser. We are trying to get to our $10,000 goal, and we're over halfway there. I think we can make it. All of the donations that are given throughout the month are being matched by a very generous donor, Brenda Walker, who's amazing. And so if you want to donate to our June fundraiser, you can do that at transmissionministry.com. There's a banner right on the top of our webpage that says, click here to donate to our fundraiser. So go there to do that. And then the other announcement is that on Friday, this Friday, in 2 days, we are having our Pride worship service here on the YouTube channel. So if you're looking at this on YouTube, you're already in the right place. You'll be here. And if you want to get a notification for when that's happening, you can click the little bell next to this video, under the video, that will give you a notification when we go live. But we have a worship service that is done by volunteers and community members, and it's going to be really fun. So keep an eye out for that on Friday. Anything else I'm missing, you two?
I think
Don't think
that's
so.
it.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you all so much for being here, everybody. We will see you back again next month for Bible Study Live. Have a great rest of your night.